The air hangs thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy. 5 decorated generals, their faces like carved granite, sit around a polished oak table. A single dossier lies open in the center. A gruff, older general stabs a finger at the file. Another one. Colonel Baranov in the Highlands. A single shot from over a kilometer in a crosswind. This ghost, this Valkyrie, is systematically erasing our command structure. Another general, younger and more anxious, leans forward. How do we fight what we cannot see? We send patrols. They find nothing but a single spent casing. We sweep the ridges. She is already gone. A 5th man, Field Marshal Volkov, has been silent until now. He takes a slow sip of his brandy, his eyes cold and dark. He speaks, and his voice cuts through the smoke like ice. Because you are trying to kill a soldier. You are mistaken. She is not a soldier. She is a myth. He leans into the light, his gaze falling on each man. And you do not fight a myth with bullets. You fight it with greed. Put a price on her head, a substantial one. Turn every mercenary, every informant from here to the border into a hunter. A slow, cruel smile touches his lips. Let's see how well a ghost can hide when the whole world is paid to find her. The wind was a blade against her cheek. It carried the scent of pine, iron-rich earth, and the sterile promise of snow. Sergeant Marta Rostova lay prone, a seamless extension of the frozen ridgeline. Her world had shrunk to the circular view through the Schmidt and Bender scope, a theater of gray rock and bruised purple sky where the only actor of consequence was a man 1,127 meters away. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a controlled, deliberate cloud dissolving into the vast indifference of the Valmarin Highlands. She was a statue carved from patience. Her rifle, a .338 Lapua Magnum, rested on its bipod, as still and cold as the rock beneath it. It was less a weapon and more a part of her nervous system, an instrument through which she projected her will across impossible distances. No change in wind, a voice murmured in her ear, a calm, low static that cut through the wind's howl. Holding steady at 10 o'clock, 5 knots. Mirage is minimal. You're clear. Elias Vance, her spotter, lay beside her, his own scope trained on the same scene. He was her anchor, the steady metronome to her focused silence. He saw the world in numbers: wind speed, humidity, barometric pressure, the subtle Coriolis drift that could tug a bullet astray. She saw it in heartbeats, the slow, steady rhythm of her own, and the flickering, fragile pulse of her target. The target was an enemy artillery commander, a colonel whose precise calculations had rained death on the valley below for weeks. Today, he had stepped out of his command bunker for a cigarette, a moment of mortal arrogance. He believed himself safe, cocooned by distance and rugged terrain. He didn't know a ghost was watching from the ridge. Marta's gloved finger rested on the trigger. She wasn't feeling the cold that seeped through her ghillie suit, nor the ache in muscles held rigid for hours. She was in the place she went when the world fell away, a state of pure, uncluttered purpose. Her mind was a silent, empty room where the only thought was the flight of the bullet. She pictured its arc, a graceful parabola of physics and intent, spinning through the thin mountain air to its final, singular destination. She let out half a breath and held it, her heartbeat slowing to a glacial pace. In the space between beats, the world fell silent. The wind's shriek, the hum of the radio, Elias's presence, it all vanished. There was only her, the rifle, and the man across the chasm. She depressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a violent but familiar embrace. The report was a sharp, hard crack that the mountains swallowed almost instantly. Through the scope, she watched the vapor trail of the bullet, a fleeting silver thread stitching the distance between them. For a fraction of a second, the colonel remained unchanged, a still portrait against the gray backdrop. Then, the kinetic energy arrived. He collapsed backward, not in a dramatic sprawl, but with the simple, final weight of a puppet whose strings had been cut. The cigarette fell from his lips, its tiny ember extinguished on the damp rock. Silence returned, deeper this time. "Target down," Elias confirmed, his voice devoid of triumph, only professional finality. "Solid hit." No movement. Marta chambered another round with fluid, economical motion. Her eyes scanned the area around the fallen colonel. No alarms, no scrambling soldiers. They were ghosts. They had touched the world and retreated into shadow before the world even knew it had been touched. For another 5 minutes, they remained motionless, letting the scene grow cold. "We're clear," she finally whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Let's move." They packed their equipment with the silent efficiency of long practice. Every piece of gear had its place. Every movement was rehearsed. Within minutes, it was as if they had never been there. As they melted back into the jagged landscape, Marta felt no elation, no flicker of victory. There was only the quiet, gnawing emptiness that followed each successful shot, a hollow space where a life used to be. She was good at her job, terrifyingly good, and in the silent, lonely places of her soul, she was beginning to understand that it was costing her everything. The return to Tactical Operations Base Alpha was a jarring transition from the muted blues and grays of the mountains to the harsh, artificial yellow of fluorescent lights. The air, thick with the smell of diesel, stale coffee, and nervous energy, was a poor substitute for the clean, cold wind. For Marta, it always felt like returning from a different plane of existence, a silent world of calculated patience, back to a loud one of raw, unfiltered humanity. She and Elias were in the debriefing room, a sterile box of metal tables and tactical maps. Major Kalin, their unit's intelligence officer, stood before them, his face grim. He held a flimsy printout as if it weighed a ton. "The colonel you neutralized was Dmitry Volkov's cousin," Kalin began, his voice low and devoid of preamble. "Intel confirms your shot sent a significant message." He paused, tapping the paper. "They've responded. As of 0600 this morning, the Kurgan High Command has issued a kill-on-sight bounty, 100,000 American dollars. The target is designated Valkyrie." A heavy silence filled the room. Elias stiffened beside her, his jaw tight. Valkyrie. A call sign she'd earned and despised. A name whispered by the enemy. A myth she never asked for. Marta's expression remained a placid mask, but inside, a cold knot formed. A bounty wasn't just a threat. It was a mark of separation. It painted a target on her back that was visible not just to the enemy, but to everyone on her own side. It made her a liability. It made her a problem to be managed. "They've never done this for a specific coalition sniper before," Kalin continued, his eyes fixed on Marta, searching for a crack in her composure. "Certainly not by name, or well by call sign. They're making it personal." The door hissed open, and Lieutenant Colonel Thorne entered, carrying his own brand of icy atmosphere. He was a tall, lean man whose uniform seemed starched with pure disapproval. He regarded Marta not as his most effective asset, but as a statistical anomaly he couldn't reconcile. "I've read the report, Major," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the tension. $100,000. He didn't look at Marta, but his words were aimed at her like bullets. This is what happens when we allow operatives to become legends. Legends attract attention. Attention attracts trouble. Now we have a sideshow. Sir, Sergeant Rostova was executing a sanctioned mission. Elias interjected, his voice firm but respectful. Her effectiveness is the reason for the bounty. Thorne finally turned his gaze on Marta. It was a cold, appraising look. Her effectiveness is not in question, Sergeant Vance. Her methodology is. She takes risks, unnecessary ones. Now that risk has a price tag, and every patrol, every mission she's on, is compromised. Every soldier around her has a bigger target on their back because of her. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Marta met his gaze without flinching. Her silence was a wall he could not breach. She knew what he saw. Not a soldier, but a woman operating in a man's world. A rogue element whose success was somehow more dangerous than her failure would have been. He saw a headline, a complication. "With all due respect, sir," Marta said, her voice quiet but resonant. "The enemy put the bounty on me. I didn't ask for it." "You didn't have to," Thorne shot back. "Your reputation precedes you, Sergeant. It's a luxury we can't afford." He turned back to Kaylin. "She's to be confined to the base until further notice. No field operations. She's a high-value asset that needs to be protected." The words "protected" felt like a cage. Marta felt a surge of cold fury, but she suppressed it, locking it down deep inside. To show emotion now would be to prove him right. It would validate every preconceived notion he had about her temperament. As Thorne swept out of the room, leaving his verdict hanging in the air, the news had already begun to ripple through the base. When Marta walked through the mess hall later, the whispers followed her like a shadow. Some looked at her with awe, others with a newfound fear. A few NCOS who had once shared jokes now avoided her eyes, their faces etched with resentment. Thorne's sentiment was not his alone. She was no longer just a teammate. She was a risk, a walking complication that could get them all killed. The bounty hadn't just made her a target for the Kurgan, it had isolated her among her own. For 3 days, the base was Marta's cage. The walls of her small quarters felt like they were shrinking, the recycled air a poor substitute for the freedom of the mountains. She spent the time not in idle frustration, but in meticulous study, poring over intelligence files she'd requested through Major Kaylin. She traced command structures, analyzed behavioral patterns, and cross-referenced satellite imagery. She was a hunter, and a cage could not change that. It only sharpened her focus. On the 4th day, she made her move. She didn't file a complaint. She requested a strategic briefing with the task force command, citing new intelligence analysis. It was an audacious request for a non-commissioned officer on lockdown, and she knew Thorne would try to block it. But the request was routed through Kaylin and flagged for General Madsen, the overall commander, a man known more for pragmatism than for rigid adherence to protocol. The briefing was granted. The room was the same one where she'd been grounded, but this time the atmosphere was even heavier. General Madsen sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the space. Thorne was at his right hand, radiating cold hostility. Major Kaylin stood by a digital map, looking nervous but supportive. "Sergeant," Madsen began, his voice a low rumble. "You requested this meeting." "The floor is yours," Marta stood, her posture erect, her gaze steady. She was not there to plead her case, but to present a solution. Sirs, my current status is a defensive posture. It treats me as a liability to be protected. This is a strategic error. The enemy has made me a symbol, a focal point. We should be using that against them. She nodded to Kalin, who brought up 5 portraits on the main screen. 5 severe-looking men in dress uniform. The bounty was authorized by the Kurgan Revolutionary Council, Marta stated, her tone crisp and analytical. These are its 5 senior military leaders: General Sokolov, the strategist; General Orlov, propaganda and psychological operations; General Morozov, logistics and finance; General Fadeev, commander of the Eastern Front, the butcher of Oskamen; and finally, the man who signed the order itself, Field Marshal Ivan Volkov. Thorn shifted in his chair. We are aware of the enemy's command structure, Sergeant. What is your point? My point, Colonel, is that you are trying to hide a magnet in a box of nails, Marta replied, turning her gaze to him. The enemy will not stop hunting me. They will send assets. They will probe our defenses. They will risk their own men to collect this bounty because of the symbolic victory it represents. This base and everyone on it is now a target because of me. A defensive strategy is a losing one. We will be waiting for an attack that will eventually come. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. My proposal is to reverse the dynamic. They are hunting one of us. I propose we hunt the 5 of them. A stunned silence fell over the room. Thorn let out a short, incredulous laugh. That is the most absurd, egotistical proposal I have ever heard. You want authorization for a personal vendetta? A one-woman suicide mission to decapitate their entire military leadership? It is not a vendetta, sir. It is a targeted surgical counteroffensive, Marta countered, her voice remaining level. They have focused their attention on me. They will be looking for me here, or expecting me to be in deep cover. They will not anticipate an immediate aggressive assault on their leadership. We have an opportunity born from their own arrogance. The risk is astronomical, Thorn snapped. We would be sending one sniper and her spotter deep into enemy territory against the 5 most heavily guarded men in the Kurgan Federation. The risk of inaction is greater, Marta insisted, turning her attention back to the general. Sir, they made this personal. It's a flaw in their strategy. They think they've intimidated us. A swift, devastating response that targets the very men who issued the threat will sow chaos and fear throughout their command structure. It nullifies the bounty not by hiding from it, but by eliminating its source. It turns their psychological operation back on them. General Madsen had been silent, his fingers steepled, his eyes studying Marta with an unreadable intensity. He had seen countless soldiers, heard countless plans. He recognized the cold, hard brilliance in her logic, but also the sheer, terrifying audacity of it. You believe this is achievable? Madsen asked quietly. It will be difficult. It will require precision, unorthodox methods, and perfect intelligence, Marta admitted. But it is achievable. Elias and I can do it. Thorn stood up. General, I must formally advise against this. This is reckless. It's an operation based on emotion, not strategy. It places the fate of this entire theater on the shoulders of one non-commissioned officer who is already a marked woman. Madsen raised a hand, silencing him. He looked from Thorn's furious face back to Marta's resolute one. He saw the institutional caution versus the warrior's instinct. For a long moment, the fate of a war hung in the balance between them. Major Kalin, the general said finally, his voice resonating with decision. Draw up a preliminary operational plan. I want a full risk assessment on my desk by 800 tomorrow. Sergeant Rostova, you will assist him. He rose from his chair. That is all. The dismissal was final. Thorne stared, aghast, but said nothing. Marta gave a single, sharp nod. She had not been granted full approval, but she had been given a chance. The cage door had been opened, just a crack. They moved like water, flowing through the cracks in the world. 2 days of silent, grueling infiltration had brought them to this place. A derelict clock tower on the outskirts of a provincial capital, the Kurgan Federation, now used as a regional command hub. 400 meters below, nestled in a cocoon of manicured lawns and high walls, was the villa where General Andrei Sokolov played his games of war. The air inside the belfry was thick with the dust of ages and the metallic scent of decay. Through a shattered archway, the villa was laid out before them like a chessboard. Elias lay prone, his spotting scope a silent sentinel. He hadn't spoken for 10 minutes, his focus absolute as he absorbed the patterns of the guards, the direction of the wind funneled between the buildings, the subtle shimmer of heat rising from the terracotta tiles. He's a man of routine, Elias murmured, his voice a low vibration in Marta's earpiece. Morning coffee on the east veranda, reads the daily briefs, paces, always paces. We have a 7-minute window once he steps out. Marta was already in position, her rifle resting on a sandbag she'd placed on the crumbling stone ledge. The shot was not exceptionally long, 854 meters, but it was complex. She would be shooting downwards at a steep angle, through layers of shifting urban heat and unpredictable wind currents. Worse, the veranda was partially shielded by a trellised archway covered in bougainvillea. The window of opportunity was not just a time, but a space, no bigger than a man's torso. This was why they had chosen Sokolov first. He was the enemy's brain. His strategies were intricate, precise, and cruelly effective. Taking him out would be like removing the queen from the board. His death would cause not just a vacuum of leadership, but a crisis of confidence. But he was also deeply ensconced behind layers of security. This mission was the proof of concept. If they could get him, they could get them all. Wind is a problem, Elias said, his tone flat. It's swirling, coming off the rooftops. I'm reading 3 knots from the west, but there's a downdraft near the target. I'll have to call it in real time. Marta didn't answer. She was already becoming part of the tower. Her breathing was slow and even, her body a study in stillness. She looked through her scope, placing the crosshairs on the empty chair on the veranda. She saw not just the target area, but the entire journey of the bullet. She felt the pull of gravity, the nudge of the wind, the subtle rotation of the earth. Stand by, Elias whispered. Movement. Target is approaching. Through the powerful magnification, a figure emerged onto the veranda. General Sokolov. He was smaller than his official portrait suggested, a man whose presence was intellectual, not physical. He held a tablet in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. He looked exactly as the intel suggested, arrogant in his safety. He's on the move. Pacing, Elias reported. Wait for him to stop. On my mark, Marta's finger found the trigger. The world outside her scope ceased to exist. There was no crumbling tower, no distant city sounds, no weight of the mission on her shoulders. There was only the breath, the heartbeat, and the math. Sokolov stopped, turning to look out over the city he commanded. He raised the mug to his lips. Wind shifting, correcting 0.2 of a mil left, Elias said, his voice urgent but controlled. Hold, now, send it! In the silent space between one heartbeat and the next, she fired. The rifle's recoil was a solid, reassuring punch. She was already cycling the bolt for a follow-up shot before the sound had fully registered, her eye never leaving the scope. She watched the bullet's invisible passage across the distance. The porcelain mug in Sokolov's hand exploded into a white cloud. A dark, precise circle appeared on his chest. He staggered back a single step, his expression one of pure, intellectual surprise, as if he'd just been presented with a logical problem he could not solve. Then he crumpled to the ground, hidden from view by the stone balustrade. "Hit! Confirmed hit!" Elias breathed, his voice tight with adrenaline. "He's down. No one's seen us. The guards are reacting to the sound, but they're looking the wrong way." Marta was already pulling the rifle back. Her movements were swift, economical. There was no time for reflection. The shot was made. The past was already gone. Only the future and the escape mattered. "Pack it up," she said, her voice a low command. "We're leaving." They disassembled their nest with the quiet haste of professionals. As they prepared to descend into the shadows of the city, Marta allowed herself one final glance at the villa below. The chessboard was in chaos. The first piece had fallen. It was not a victory, she knew. It was a statement, and it was only the beginning. The safe house was a purgatory of beige walls and mismatched furniture. It was anonymous, stripped of identity, a place meant for ghosts to pass through. After the clean, sharp lethality of their mission and the tense, silent exfiltration through hostile territory, the stillness of the small apartment was deafening. Success felt less like a triumph and more like a vacuum. News had filtered through via a coded data burst hours earlier. General Sokolov's death had sent a seismic shock through the Kurgan command. Their communications were a frantic storm of confusion and paranoia. General Madsen's reply was a single, sterile word. Acknowledged. 1 down, 4 to go. The war machine had processed their achievement and was already looking to the next objective. Elias sat at the small kitchen table, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, practiced motions. He had tried to bridge the silence earlier, offering her a heated ration pack, his expression etched with a concern he wouldn't voice. She had refused with a quiet shake of her head. It wasn't a rejection of him, but a retreat into the fortress of herself, and he was wise enough to give her the space she needed. He understood that the hardest part of the mission often began after the last shot was fired. When she was finally alone in the small, dim bedroom, Marta sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind the familiar, bone-deep weariness. From beneath her shirt, she pulled out a thin, tarnished silver chain. On it hung a small, dented oval locket. It was plain, unadorned, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of her thumb. She clicked it open. The locket didn't hold pictures. Instead, pressed under the tiny frames, were 2 small, dried wildflowers, a mountain lavender and a white edelweiss, their colors faded to muted ghosts of what they once were. The faint, dusty scent of them rose to meet her, a key unlocking a door in her mind that she kept bolted shut. The memory rises unbidden. It is not a story, but a feeling. The sun is warm on her face. The air is alive with the hum of bees and the laughter of children. She is 16, her hands stained with the purple juice of wild berries. A boy named Stefan, his hair the color of wheat, is weaving the same 2 flowers into a crown for her hair. His fingers are clumsy, but his smile is easy and bright. The mountains of her home stand guard around the valley. their snowy peaks sharp against a perfect blue sky. It is a moment of impossible peace, a world away from war, a universe away from the woman on the bed. A crown for the queen of the mountain, he says, his voice full of the gentle earnestness of youth. He places it on her head, and the scent of the crushed flowers is the scent of life itself. Then, a sound that does not belong, the distant rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades growing louder. The laughter in the valley falters, heads turn towards the sky. The sound is a predator, dark and heavy, and it is coming for their peace. It is the sound of the world breaking. Marta snapped the locket shut. The click was unnaturally loud in the silent room. She squeezed it in her fist, the dented edges pressing into her palm. The memory was not a comfort. It was fuel. It was a whetstone on which she sharpened her purpose. Stefan, her family, the entire village, they were all gone, erased in the fire and fury of an operation overseen by a man on a list, a man named Volkov. The bounty on her head was a meaningless number. The strategic value of her targets was a cold calculation for men like Madsen and Thorne. For her, this was not a campaign. It was an excavation. She was digging through the ruins of her life, one general at a time, searching for a justice that she knew, even then, she would never find. She tucked the locket back under her shirt, the cool metal a familiar weight against her skin. The weariness was still there, but beneath it, the cold, hard resolve had settled once more. She was a ghost, yes, but ghosts had their reasons, and hers were waiting for her. 4 of them, across the border. The city of Oleningrad smelled of fear. It was a mixture of damp coal smoke, uncollected refuse, and the metallic tang of military occupation. Here, Marta and Elias were not ghosts on a mountain. They were minnows in a shark tank, hidden only by the sheer number of other fish. Dressed in the drab, worn clothing of locals, they moved through the city's arteries, their weapons concealed in a specially modified pushcart, their faces anonymous masks of weary resignation. Their target was General Nikolai Orlov, a man who wielded a television camera more deftly than a rifle. He was an architect of lies, building a reality where occupation was liberation and resistance was terrorism. Their intelligence, confirmed by local partisans, placed him as the keynote speaker at a unity rally in the city's central square that afternoon. It was a piece of political theater, and Orlov was the star. Their nest was the 3rd-floor office of a derelict textile factory overlooking the square. The windows were grimy, the air thick with the ghosts of industry. From their vantage point, they watched the square slowly fill. Kurgan soldiers, looking tense, lined the perimeter while coerced citizens and a few genuine loyalists gathered before a large, flag-draped stage. It was a sniper's nightmare. "I don't like this, Marta," Elias said, his voice a low hum as he scanned the crowd through his scope. "Too many variables, too many civilians. Look at them. Kids, old women, a stray round, an overpenetration. This could be a massacre." Marta was silent, her own scope trained on the podium. She felt a cold sickness coiling in her gut. Her previous targets had been legitimate military combatants, isolated and removed. This was different. Through the powerful lens, she could see individual faces in the crowd. A young boy holding a small paper flag, his expression more confused than patriotic. An elderly couple huddled together, their eyes filled with a deep, abiding fear. These people formed the backdrop to her mission, a living, breathing margin of error she could not afford. The rules of engagement were clear. zero collateral damage. If the shot was not 100% clean, they were to abort. But the strategic imperative was just as clear. Orlov's propaganda was poison, turning neighbors against each other and fueling the Kurgan war machine with false justifications. Killing him here, at the height of his power, would be a devastating blow to enemy morale. "He's arriving," Elias announced. A motorcade swept into the square. General Orlov emerged, a charismatic, silver-haired man who waved to the crowd with a politician's practiced ease. He climbed the stage, basking in the forced applause. Marta tracked him, her crosshairs settling on his chest. But he was never still. Moving between the podium and the edge of the stage, a Kurgan flag fluttering behind him. The wind was gusting unpredictably, snatching at the banners and making a precise shot a matter of luck as much as skill. "He's too mobile," she murmured, more to herself than to Elias. "The wind is all over the place." "The crowd is shifting too," Elias added. "People are being pushed forward. The clear lane is closing. The moral weight of the moment was suffocating. Every instinct she had screamed at her to wait, to abort. But she also knew this was likely their only chance. Another image flashed in her mind, the face of the young boy with the paper flag. What right did she have to risk his life for her mission? The faces of her own village answered back. What right did she have to let this man continue his work of lies and death? Orlov stepped to the podium and began to speak, his voice booming through the square's speakers. He spoke of glory, of destiny, of a shared heritage. It was a masterful performance. And as he reached a crescendo, he raised both arms in a triumphant gesture. For a single, fleeting second, he was perfectly still. The wind died, the flag behind him hung limp, the crowd was mesmerized, their attention fixed on him. In that instant, Marta saw it, a clean, unobstructed line. It was now or never. The choice was hers. Her mind went utterly calm. She was not a woman, not a ghost of the past, but an instrument of consequence. She breathed out, and in the silent space where her lungs were empty, she sent the bullet. The shot was a dry pop, lost in the echoes of Orlov's amplified voice. Through the scope, she saw the general jolt, a dark bloom appearing on the immaculate white of his uniform. He stared down at his own chest with a look of profound betrayal before collapsing behind the podium. Panic erupted. The square turned into a screaming, chaotic sea of humanity. "Let's go." "Now," Marta commanded, already pulling her equipment back. They didn't run. They packed their cart and joined the surge of terrified civilians, becoming two more anonymous faces in the crowd. They moved with the current, their heads down, letting the wave of chaos carry them away from the scene. They had done it. The shot was clean. But as Marta glanced back at the square, at the soldiers firing into the air and the people trampling each other to escape, she felt no relief. This victory was tainted, covered in the grime of the city and the fear of the innocent. It was a necessary act, but she knew its moral cost would linger long after they had vanished into the alleys. The farmhouse smelled of damp earth and rotting wood. It was their temporary sanctuary, a forgotten homestead miles from the chaos of Oleningrad. But Marta could not wash the city from her mind. For 2 days, she had moved in a state of quiet, coiled tension. She field-stripped and cleaned her rifle 3 times, each movement a precise, repetitive ritual designed to occupy her hands and silence her thoughts. It wasn't working. Elias watched her from the doorway of the small, dusty kitchen. He had seen her cold, focused, and utterly resolute. He had seen her exhausted after a long infiltration, but he had never seen her like this. Haunted. Her gaze would often drift to the grimy window, looking out at nothing, but he knew she was seeing the square, the panicked crowd, the face of the boy with the paper flag. The perfect shot had come at an imperfect price, and the debt was being paid now, in the silence. He knew the professional boundary between them was a carefully constructed wall that allowed them to function. He was the numbers, the data, the calm voice of reason. She was the instinct, the focus, the finality. To cross that line was to risk upsetting the delicate equilibrium that kept them alive. But watching her now, he saw that the wall was also a prison, and it was crushing her. He poured the last of their boiled water into 2 chipped ceramic mugs, stirring a packet of instant coffee into each. He walked over to where she sat on a wooden crate, her rifle disassembled on a clean cloth before her. He placed one of the mugs on the floor beside her. She didn't look up, but her hands stilled their work. "I'm not thirsty," she said, her voice flat. "I know," Elias replied, sitting on a crate opposite her. "It's not for thirst. It's for the warmth." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the faint hiss of the wind through the farmhouse's broken slats. The steam from the mugs rose between them like a fragile truce. He didn't push. He just waited, offering his presence as an anchor. Finally, her shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible change. But to him it was like a landslide. A single ragged breath escaped her lips. "He had a son," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Orlov. Intel brief said he had a 12-year-old son." Elias said nothing. It was a fact, a piece of data he had also known but had compartmentalized. "I kept seeing him," she continued, her eyes fixed on a piece of the rifle's bolt carrier group. "In the crowd. A dozen different boys. Any one of them could have been him. Any one of them could have been in the path of the bullet if the wind had changed, if my calculation was off by a single millimeter." Her hand, holding a small cleaning brush, began to tremble. It was a slight, almost invisible tremor, but in a woman whose stillness was legendary, it was an earthquake. This was the crack in the armor, the moment of vulnerability she never allowed anyone to see. Elias reached out, not with a platitude or a reassurance, but with a simple gesture. He gently took the trembling hand in his own, his grip firm and steady. He carefully removed the cleaning brush from her fingers and set it aside. "But it wasn't off, Marta," he said, his voice low and certain. "Your calculation was perfect. Your shot was perfect. You did what no one else could do, and you did it without harming a single innocent person. What you're feeling now is the weight. It means you're still human." She finally looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the full, crushing cost of her strength. He saw the 16-year-old girl from the mountain village, the ghost in the locket, warring with the hardened soldier. She didn't pull her hand away. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean on his strength, to share the burden she had always carried alone. "I trust you, Marta," he said quietly. "Not just your skill. I trust you." The words landed in the broken silence of the room and began to heal it. The tremor in her hand subsided. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of the debt and the trust that now passed between them. She gently withdrew her hand and picked up the piece of her rifle again. Her movements were steady once more. The wall between them was gone, replaced by something stronger. A bridge. He was no longer just her spotter. He was the keeper of her secret, the witness to the crack in her armor. and in the lonely, violent world they inhabited, that made him the only ally she truly had. General Timur Fadeev, the butcher of Oskamen, was not a man who hid in villas or gave speeches. He was a creature of the front lines, a blunt instrument of war who commanded from a fortified bunker complex dug into the mud and rock of the volatile Eastern Front. Hunting him meant crawling into the belly of the beast. Their hide was a precarious perch in the skeletal remains of a shelled-out factory, 1,000 meters from the bunker's entrance. The air tasted of rust and cordite, and the ground trembled with the distant rhythmic thunder of artillery. The enemy was on edge. The deaths of 2 high-ranking generals had bred a virulent paranoia. Patrols were constant, their search patterns erratic. "They're jumpy," Elias noted, his voice a clipped whisper in her ear. "They're actively looking for us now. This isn't like before." "It makes him predictable," Marta countered. "He'll want to project strength. Show his men he's not afraid." Her prediction proved correct. Just after midday, Fadeev emerged from the bunker, surrounded by a coterie of subordinate officers. He was a bear of a man, thick-necked and brutal, his presence a physical manifestation of the violence he commanded. He stood in the open, reviewing tactical maps spread on the hood of an armored vehicle. It was an act of pure, contemptuous defiance. "That's him," Elias confirmed. "Range is 970. Wind is negligible. It's the cleanest shot we're going to get." Marta drew a slow breath, settling her crosshairs. This kill felt different. It was less a strategic move and more an extermination. She held, waited for a subordinate to step aside, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was instantly swallowed by the din of the front. Fadeev collapsed, his bulk falling heavily onto the maps, scattering them like dead leaves. The shot was perfect, but the aftermath was not. There was no chaos, no confusion. Instead, a klaxon blared from the command bunker, a shrieking, piercing sound. The officers around Fadeev's body didn't scatter. They drew their sidearms and took cover, their heads all turning in the same direction, towards the factory. They were waiting for it, Elias hissed, already pulling back from his scope. It was a trap. They used him as bait. A fraction of a second later, the air beside Marta's head cracked with a supersonic boom as a round slammed into the concrete pillar she was using for cover. Then another. "Counter-sniper," she yelled, rolling away from the ledge. "They have us pinned." The hunt was over. The fight for survival had begun. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of noise and violence. Heavy machine gun fire tore through the factory's rusted walls, shredding metal and pulverizing concrete. Marta and Elias were no longer snipers. They were infantry, trapped and outnumbered. "We have to move!" Elias shouted over the din, chambering a round in his own assault rifle, a compact carbine he carried for just such a contingency. "They'll have teams moving to flank us." Marta slung her sniper rifle, too cumbersome for close quarters, and drew her pistol. They moved in a crouch, darting between crumbling pillars and heaps of ruined machinery. The disciplined chatter of enemy radios echoed from below. They were being surrounded. A 4-man fire team burst through a doorway on their left. Marta didn't hesitate. 2 shots, center mass, dropping the first 2. Elias opened up with a controlled burst, forcing the other 2 back into cover. "Stairs are a death trap," she yelled, her mind racing, processing angles and exits. "The south wall!" The shelling breached it. "We can get to the outer trenches." They fought their way through the decaying structure, a blur of motion and controlled aggression. This was a different kind of skill, not the cold patience of the sniper, but the hot, reactive instinct of a close-quarters fighter. They moved with the terrifying synergy of two people who knew each other's thoughts, covering angles, reloading, and flowing around each other without a wasted word. They reached the breach in the south wall and tumbled through it, landing in the muddy labyrinth of an old trench system. They were out of the factory, but they were still deep inside the lion's den. "Go! Go!" Elias urged, laying down suppressive fire as Marta scrambled ahead. They ran, their lungs burning, the sounds of shouting and gunfire echoing behind them. They had killed the butcher, but his soldiers were now baying for their blood. The mission was a success, but the cost was a near-fatal compromising of their position. As they vanished into the war-torn landscape, heading for an emergency extraction point they hoped was still viable, one truth was seared into Marta's mind. The enemy was learning. They were adapting. From now on, they weren't just the hunters. They were also the hunted. The debriefing room felt smaller and more suffocating than ever before. Exhaustion was a physical weight on Marta's shoulders, a gritty film in her eyes. She and Elias had been extracted by the skin of their teeth, their gear battered, their bodies bruised. But the hardest part of the mission was only just beginning. General Madsen sat at the head of the table, his expression an unreadable mask of granite. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne stood pacing by the tactical map, his movements sharp and agitated, like a caged predator. "Let's be clear about what happened," Thorne began, his voice cutting through the room with prosecutorial force. He didn't look at Marta or Elias. He addressed the general. Mission objective was met. General Fadeev is dead, but the cost was a complete operational compromise and the near loss of two of our most specialized assets. The question is, why? The enemy had a counter-sniper protocol in place, Marta stated, her voice hoarse but steady. Their response was instantaneous and coordinated. They weren't searching. They were reacting. They knew where we were. Thorne stopped pacing and turned to her, his lips curled in a condescending smirk. "Or, Sergeant, your infiltration was not as clean as you believed. Your desire for a dramatic, high-risk position put you in a predictable location. Did you at any point deviate from the ingress route approved by this command?" The accusation was clear. She was insubordinate. "No, Colonel," Elias interjected, his voice firm. "We followed the plan to the letter. We observed a full 24-hour cycle before setting up our hide. There was no indication we had been detected." "And yet you were," Thorne shot back. "Within seconds of your shot, they had you zeroed." "That doesn't suggest a leak, Sergeant Vance. It suggests a mistake, a sloppy setup, overconfidence." He looked back at Marta. "This campaign of yours was approved against my better judgment. I warned that your reputation would make you a liability. It seems I was right. You're not a ghost anymore, Sergeant. You're a celebrity, and you're starting to act like it." The insult was designed to provoke, to make her emotional, to confirm his bias. But Marta's anger was a cold, dense star inside her. She met his gaze, her own expression unyielding. "With all due respect, Colonel, you're ignoring the evidence to fit your narrative," she said, her tone dangerously calm. The enemy response was not just fast, it was specific. They didn't saturate the area. They targeted one derelict factory from a dozen possible locations. They weren't waiting for a sniper. They were waiting for me. She stood up and walked to the map, pointing to the location of the factory. This position was chosen because it was the only one that provided a clean shot. It was tactically sound. The only way the enemy could have known with such certainty is if they had our operational parameters, or at least a part of them. "Are you suggesting we have a leak, Sergeant?" General Madsen asked, his voice low and serious. It was the first time he had spoken. "It's a possibility that must be considered, sir," Marta replied. Thorne scoffed. "A leak! The convenient excuse of an operative who was nearly captured. It's far more likely that her growing legend has made her reckless. She is hunting men, General, not fulfilling strategic objectives. This is becoming a personal vendetta, and her emotional involvement is clouding her judgment." The room fell silent. Thorne's accusation hung in the air, a direct assault on her professionalism and her psychological stability. This was his endgame, to prove she was an unstable woman unfit for the task. Elias stood. "Sir, I have served with Sergeant Rostova on every one of these missions. Her judgment is impeccable. Her discipline is absolute. We were compromised by enemy intelligence, not by incompetence. I'd stake my life on it." Madsen looked from Thorne's rigid fury to Marta's cold composure, then to Elias's unwavering loyalty. He was a man caught between a politically savvy subordinate who confirmed institutional biases and a pair of operatives who were telling him a deeply uncomfortable truth. "Your report is noted," Madsen said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The campaign is suspended pending a full internal review." He looked directly at Marta. "And you, Sergeant, will be subject to a full psychological evaluation. That is all." The words were a hammer blow. It was worse than being grounded. It was a formal questioning of her sanity. Thorne had won this round. As she and Elias walked out of the room, the invisible wall between them and the rest of the command had become solid brick. They were no longer heroes or assets. They were problems, suspects. And Marta knew that with 2 generals left on her list, the most dangerous enemy she now faced might not be the one in the field, but the one walking the halls of her own base. The suspension was a lie, a piece of theater for the benefit of Thorne and anyone he might be speaking to. 24 hours after her psychological evaluation, a sterile, condescending interview she'd navigated with icy precision, Marta and Elias were given new coordinates by General Madsen in a private, off-the-record briefing. No radio contact, no official support. "You don't exist," Madsen had told them, his eyes hard. "General Morozov is overseeing a weapons-grade uranium transfer at a remote processing facility in the Zalog swamps. The intel for this mission has not passed through normal channels. Only the 3 of us know. If the enemy is waiting for you this time, we'll have our answer." The Zalog swamps were a special kind of hell, a vast, flat expanse of frozen mud, skeletal trees, and stagnant, ice-choked water. For 3 days, they lay in a meticulously concealed hide on a low rise overlooking the processing facility, a grim complex of concrete and razor wire. The cold was a living thing, a relentless predator that gnawed at them through their thermal gear. It wasn't the sharp, clean cold of the mountains. It was a damp, insidious chill that sank into their bones. Patience became their only currency. Their world shrank to the view through their optics. They watched convoys of trucks come and go. They observed shift changes with a mind-numbing regularity. They ate cold rations, their movements slow and minimal to conserve heat and avoid detection by the thermal scopes they knew the enemy employed. General Morozov, the man who funded the Kurgan war machine, was as elusive as a ghost. He lived inside the most heavily fortified building in the complex, never showing his face. The waiting was a physical and psychological grind. It was a test designed by Thorne, repurposed by Madsen. Marta could feel the weight of the colonel's accusation with every passing hour. Reckless, emotional, unstable. The words were a quiet poison. "Anything?" She whispered to Elias during a shift change, her voice a dry rasp. Nothing. He's a creature of paranoia, Elias whispered back, his breath fogging the air. But he can't stay inside forever. The transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning. He'll have to oversee it personally. During the long, frozen nights, Marta found herself staring into the oppressive darkness, wrestling with the silence. The forced inactivity was worse than any firefight. It gave her too much time to think. She thought of Thorne's smug certainty and the doubt she'd seen flickering in Madsen's eyes. This mission wasn't just about killing Morozov. It was about reclaiming her own credibility. It was about proving that the instincts Thorne called emotion were, in fact, the very thing that made her so effective. On the dawn of the fourth day, it happened. A heavily armored convoy pulled up to the main loading bay, and from the central building, a figure emerged, surrounded by a tight phalanx of elite guards. General Morozov. He was a small, neat man in a spotless greatcoat, his face pinched and perpetually worried. "That's him," Elias confirmed. "They're loading the container now. He won't be out for long." The shot was fraught with new difficulties. The distance was over 1,200 meters. A fickle wind was skimming across the frozen swamp, creating unpredictable eddies. The extreme cold could affect the propellant burn rate, changing the bullet's trajectory. And Marta was tired, her body stiff and slow from days of immobility. She pushed it all aside. She went to the quiet room in her mind. She became the rifle. She watched Morozov as he barked an order at a subordinate, his arrogance briefly overcoming his paranoia. He stepped away from his guards, pointing at the container, giving her a clear 2-second window. Elias called the adjustments, his voice a calm anchor in the biting wind. "Heavy crosswind, give it 1.5 mils right. Add a tenth for the temperature. He's all yours." She exhaled, her breath a prayer to physics. She pressed the trigger. The recoil felt sluggish in the cold. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she thought she'd missed. Then, through the scope, she saw the small, neat man fall, his collapse almost anticlimactic against the vast, indifferent landscape. They held their breath, waiting for the klaxons, for the instant, coordinated response, for the counter-sniper fire. Nothing. There was shouting, confusion, guards scrambling to form a perimeter, but it was chaos, not coordination. It was the organic reaction of a force that had been struck by lightning from a clear sky. They weren't prepared. They hadn't been warned. Elias let out a slow, steadying breath. "They didn't know," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "They didn't know we were here. They had him. And they had their proof." As they began to meticulously break down their position, the exhaustion was still there. The cold was still biting. But the oppressive weight of doubt had begun to lift. The mission had been a success. But more importantly, it was a vindication. They were back. Not to the main base with its whispers and politics, but to a forward operating post, a temporary island of relative safety. The news of Morozov's death and the telling lack of a coordinated response had vindicated them. Thorne was silenced, an internal investigation into a potential leak was underway, and their mission was officially reinstated. It should have been a victory. But as Marta sat on a cot, the silence of their quarters humming around her, she felt only a profound and terrifying emptiness. 4 down. 1 to go. Field Marshal Ivan Volkov. The name was not just a target on a list. It was a ghost that had lived in the ruins of her memory for a decade. The other generals had been strategic objectives, tactical problems to be solved. Volkov was the endpoint. He was the reason. And now that he was the only one left, the carefully constructed walls between soldier and survivor, between duty and revenge, began to crumble. Elias found her not cleaning her rifle, but holding the small, dented locket in her open palm, staring at it as if it held the secrets of the universe. Her sniper rifle, the instrument of her power, was propped, forgotten, in a corner. He sat down on a crate nearby, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. He didn't speak, sensing that this was a different kind of quiet, a more fragile one than before. "Do you ever wonder what the difference is?" she asked, her voice so low he barely heard it. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the locket. "The difference between what?" he asked gently. "Between us and them," she said. "Between a soldier carrying out an order and an assassin settling a score. Is there a line, or do we just draw it where it makes us feel better?" The question hung in the air, raw and honest. This wasn't the detached professional he knew. This was someone else, someone standing at a precipice. "We follow rules of engagement," he began, the textbook answer feeling hollow even as he said it. "Do we?" she interrupted, finally looking at him. Her eyes were dark with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I killed 4 men, Elias. Powerful men, dangerous men. I did it for the mission, for the strategy. I told myself that. But Volkov, he's different, and I'm afraid that when I look at him through my scope, I won't see a field marshal. I'll see the man who gave the order. I'll see the smoke rising from my village. And I'm afraid that pulling that trigger will be for no one but the 16-year-old girl who lost everything." She took a shaky breath. "And I'm terrified that it won't bring me any peace. That it will just be one more ghost. The last and most terrible ghost of all." She closed her hand around the locket. "I'm thinking of telling Madsen I can't do it. That the mission is done. 4 out of 5 is a strategic victory. Maybe it's better to leave the last one." She was offering him an exit, a way out of the final, most personal, and most dangerous mission of all. Elias was silent for a long moment, choosing his words with the same care he chose his equipment. "The girl you were deserves to be angry, Marta. What happened to her was an atrocity. Her reasons are a part of you. You don't have to pretend they're not." He leaned forward slightly. "But she is not the one pulling the trigger. I've been with you. I've watched you. When you're in the nest, you are the most disciplined soldier I have ever known. You took a shot that could have killed civilians to get Orlov, and you made it perfect because your discipline was stronger than your anxiety. You endured days of freezing cold to get Morozov because your focus was stronger than your misery." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Your past is your reason for being here, but it doesn't have to be your reason for finishing. You can finish this because it's your duty. You can finish it because removing a man like Volkov will save other villages, other 16-year-old girls. You can make that choice. The person you are now can make that choice." He wasn't dismissing her pain or her fear. He was acknowledging it, honoring it, and showing her that she was stronger than it. He was giving her back her own agency. She didn't answer. She simply looked down at the locket in her fist, then slowly, deliberately, tucked it back under her shirt. The conflict in her eyes didn't vanish, but it settled, like embers after a fire. The terrible, consuming blaze of vengeance was gone, replaced by a grim, hard, and resolute glow. She would see this through, not as an avenger, and not just as a soldier, but as both. She would go as the woman she was now to finish the war, the girl she once was, had to endure. The mood in the Tactical Operations Center was funereal. The large holographic map at the center of the room displayed a 3D rendering of a jagged, inhospitable mountain range. Nestled within its highest peak was a fortress, a brutalist scar of concrete and steel designated Citadel Vostok, the Eagle's Nest. Field Marshal Ivan Volkov was not hiding. He had retreated to his throne. Major Kalin stood before the map, his face pale under the harsh lighting. General Madsen was a stone statue at the head of the table. Even Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, present but silent, seemed to have lost his usual caustic demeanor, replaced by a grim, analytical focus. Field Marshal Volkov has recalled his personal guard, the Wimpel elite, to the Citadel, Kalin began, his voice clinical, betraying none of the dread the information inspired. He is directing all remaining strategic operations from its command center. He knows we are coming for him. He is inviting us to try. The map zoomed in, and layers of data began to overlay the fortress. The image became a hornet's nest of threat indicators. The Citadel is a Tier 1 defensive installation, Kalin continued. The outer perimeter is a ring of seismic sensors and pressure plate mines. This is followed by a 2-kilometer kill zone, constantly monitored by thermal and optical scopes from a series of interlocking watchtowers. The towers are manned by counter-sniper teams, operating in 24-hour shifts. The fortress itself has its own short-range air defense system. A conventional long-range shot is not viable. There are no viable firing positions that are not under constant surveillance. He paused, letting the impossibility of the situation settle in the room. In short, it's a fortress designed to repel a battalion, and we are proposing to send in 2 people. He looked at Marta and Elias, who stood at ease, their expressions unreadable. The plan, Kalin said, is therefore one of infiltration. A severe winter storm is forecast to move into the region in 36 hours. It's our only window. The storm will degrade their thermal imaging and provide acoustic cover. A special operations team will create a diversionary attack on a supply convoy 10 kilometers to the north, drawing the attention of their primary reaction force. The map shifted, highlighting a narrow, treacherous goat path that wound its way up the mountain's unforgiving western face. While the diversion is underway, Rostova and Vance will undertake a high-altitude, low-opening jump, landing here, on this plateau. From there, it's a 12-hour climb in blizzard conditions to reach the designated firing position, a small, concealed ventilation shaft that services the Citadel's geothermal vents. It is the only known structural weakness, the only spot not under direct electronic surveillance. The image zoomed in on a small, grated opening on a sheer cliff face, hundreds of feet above the main fortress entrance. The shot will be over 1,300 meters, downwards at a near 70-degree angle through the storm. If you make it, exfiltration will be via the same route. The room was utterly silent. It wasn't a plan. It was a death wish, a series of improbable events that had to align perfectly to even grant them a 1% chance of success. Thorne spoke for the first time, his voice low, stripped of its usual antagonism. The Wimpel Guards. They are not soldiers. They are fanatics, loyal to Volkov personally. Even if you make the shot, they will hunt you to the ends of the earth. It wasn't an objection. It was a statement of fact, a warning. Marta finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. What is Volkov's daily routine inside the Citadel? The question was so practical, so devoid of fear, that it momentarily startled Kalin. He takes a mandatory inspection of the command center every morning at 0700. He stands at the main tactical overview window for approximately 3 minutes. That window will be your target. The ventilation shaft, Elias said, his eyes narrowed on the map. What is its composition? Steel alloy? Can we cut through the grate silently? They continued for another 10 minutes, asking questions not about the odds, but about the mission's fine details. The storm's predicted wind speed, the patrol schedule of the outer guards, the power grid of the fortress. They were disassembling the suicide mission into a series of manageable, if terrifying, problems. Finally, General Madsen stood. The briefing was over. He walked over to Marta and Elias, his face carved with the weight of his command. What I am asking of you is beyond any reasonable expectation of duty, he said. His voice a low rumble meant only for them. There will be no shame in refusing this mission. Marta met his gaze. Her mind was clear, her purpose absolute. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a familiar companion. The 16-year-old girl in the locket was silent. It was the soldier who answered. We accept the mission, sir. The fall from the sky was a silent, frozen baptism. For 30,000 feet, they were nothing but plummeting ghosts, the world a distant, abstract map below. The blizzard raged beneath them, a swirling vortex of white that promised to swallow them whole. Marta's breath was ice in her lungs. When she pulled the cord, the canopy opened with a violent crack, and the brutal reality of the storm hit them like a physical blow. They landed hard in waist-deep powder, the wind tearing at them, the snow a blinding, suffocating curtain. The diversionary attack had begun to the north, a faint, muffled crump of explosions that was almost instantly devoured by the storm's roar. They were alone. They were on the clock. The climb was a waking nightmare. Every step was a battle against the mountain and the blizzard. The wind shrieked, trying to peel them from the icy rock face. Snow, driven hard as buckshot, stung any exposed skin and packed into their gear. They moved in a bubble of shared misery and absolute focus, communicating with hand signals. Their trust in each other, the only thing holding them to the side of the world. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the burning ache in their muscles and the slow, agonizing progress up the western face. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the outer perimeter, the minefield. According to the intel, the pressure plates were calibrated to ignore the weight of snow, but the storm had created deep, unpredictable drifts. Every step was a prayer. Elias led, using a thin probe to test the ground ahead, his movements painstakingly slow. Marta covered him, her head on a constant swivel, her senses screaming with tension. They cleared the minefield and began to navigate the sensor grid, a web of seismic and thermal detectors. The blizzard was their ally here, its fury masking their heat signatures and footsteps. They were close. The sheer, dark wall of the citadel was now a looming shadow above them. That was when they saw the patrol. 3 figures in heavy winter gear, their forms barely visible through the swirling snow, sweeping the area with thermal optics. They were Vimpel elite, moving with the eerie confidence of predators in their own territory. Down, Marta breathed, and they flattened themselves behind a rock outcropping, the snow quickly burying them. The patrol drew closer. One of them stopped, tilting his head as if he'd heard something through the storm's howl. He raised his rifle. He was going to check their position. There was no choice. It had to be silent. It had to be now. Marta exploded from the snow, a phantom in white. She drove her combat knife into the first guard's side, under his armor, cutting off his cry. At the same moment, Elias surged forward, his suppressed pistol coughing twice, dropping the second guard. The third spun around, raising his weapon, but Elias was already on him, tackling him to the ground. There was a brutal, desperate struggle in the snow. Marta turned to help, but heard a sickening, wet crunch and a sharp, agonized grunt from Elias. The third guard lay dead, his neck broken, but he had driven his own knife deep into Elias's thigh during the struggle. Blood, shockingly dark, bloomed against the white snow. "Elias!" Marta scrambled to his side, pulling out a field dressing. The wound was bad, a deep, arterial gash. "Damn it!" Elias gritted out, his face pale with shock and pain. He pressed his hands to the wound, but the blood flowed freely between his fingers. "Tourniquet, quick!" She worked with frantic precision, her mind a cold, clear island in a sea of panic. She cinched the tourniquet high on his leg, twisting it until the bleeding slowed to a trickle, sluggish ooze. He was losing blood fast. He was going into shock. The climb was over for him. The mission was over. "I have to get you out of here," she said, her voice tight. "No," he rasped, grabbing her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "No. The mission. You go. Volkov. I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted, his breath coming in ragged pants. "The window is closing. The storm. It's our only chance. Don't let this be for nothing, Marta." He pushed his carbine towards her. "Go." "That's an order." She looked at his pain-racked face, then at the dark shadow of the citadel looming above them. He was right. It was all or nothing. To retreat now would be to waste his sacrifice, to waste everything. With a final, agonizing look, she made the choice. She dragged him into the relative shelter of the rocks, packing snow around him to insulate him from the wind. She checked his wound one last time, placed a loaded pistol in his hand, and gave him her remaining morphine injector. "I'm coming back for you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not afford to feel. He just nodded, his eyes already beginning to glaze over. She turned and faced the citadel alone. The weight of her rifle felt heavier than ever before. Now she was not just carrying the burden of the mission. She was carrying his life, too. She was one woman against a fortress, and the storm was her only shield. The final ascent was a fugue state of pain, cold, and singular purpose. Marta moved on autopilot, her body a machine running on the last of its fuel. The thought of Elias, bleeding and alone in the storm below, was a constant, agonizing spur. She reached the ventilation shaft, a small black square against the vast white face of the mountain, her hands raw and numb. The grate was thick steel alloy, just as the intel had suggested. Using a small, silent plasma cutter, she worked with a surgeon's precision, the tool's intense heat a strange comfort in the freezing air. She carved out a section just large enough to poke the barrel of her rifle through, then slipped into the narrow, dark shaft, a metal tomb suspended over a sheer drop. She set up her rifle, her movements economical, her mind stripped of everything but the task. Through the scope, the world was a swirling vortex of snow. But below, shielded from the worst of the blizzard by the mountain's overhang, was a large, armored window. The command center of the Eagle's Nest. It was 6:59. Her breathing was steady. Her heart was a slow, heavy drum. She was the soldier. She was in control. At 7 o'clock on the dot, he appeared. Field Marshal Ivan Volkov. He walked to the window, a cup in his hand, his posture radiating the absolute certainty of a man who believed himself a god in his own sky-bound fortress. He looked out at the storm, his expression impassive. Marta settled the crosshairs over his heart, and then the past came for her. It was not a memory. It was an ambush. The smell of pine and wild berries was suddenly replaced by the acrid stench of smoke. The howl of the wind became the shriek of dying villagers. She saw it all through the scope as if it were happening right now. The dark green helicopters descending like locusts. The soldiers with Volkov's insignia on their shoulders pouring into the fields. The bright, innocent flame of Stefan's wheaten hair turning dark in the rising smoke. The memory was a tidal wave of rage and grief, and it drowned the soldier, leaving only the 16-year-old girl, shaking with a hatred so pure it was a physical force. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the pressure building. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She wanted to destroy him, not just kill him. She wanted to send the bullet through his eye, to erase the face that haunted her, to make his death a scream of agony that would echo her own. Vengeance was a hot, sweet poison in her veins. This was her right. This was the justice she had earned through a decade of nightmares. The soldier was gone. The girl was about to fire. I trust you, Marta. Not just your skill. I trust you. Elias's voice, a quiet anchor in the storm of her rage. It cut through the screaming ghosts of the past. What had he trusted? The girl consumed by hatred? Or the woman who had held his hand in the dark? The soldier who had made a perfect, clean shot in a square full of civilians because it was the right thing to do? She squeezed her eyes shut for a second. The images of fire and death receded, replaced by Elias's pale, pain-racked face as he pushed her to go on. He had trusted her to finish the mission, not her private war. Her eyes opened. The rage was still there, a white-hot coal deep inside her, but it no longer controlled her. She took a single, deep, cleansing breath, and the soldier returned, pushing the grieving girl aside with a gentle but firm hand. Her finger relaxed on the trigger. Her breathing slowed. The violent tremor in her hands ceased. She shifted her aim, away from the head, away from the face that fueled her hate. She placed the crosshairs calmly, deliberately, back over the center of his chest. A professional shot. An act of war, not of rage. An execution, not a murder. She exhaled, and in the silent space where the world stood still, she fired. Through the scope, she watched Volkov jolt and collapse out of sight. The final target was down. A profound, hollow silence descended upon her, deeper than the silence of the mountains, quieter than the snow. There was no elation, no satisfaction. The rage was not quenched. It had simply been rendered irrelevant. The ghosts of her past did not vanish. They simply fell quiet. She had won. Not when the bullet struck Volkov's heart, but in the single, eternal moment she chose where it would land. Without a second's hesitation, she began to break down her rifle. The mission was complete. Now she had to go back for her friend. The journey back to Elias was a descent into a private hell. Every instinct screamed at Marta to be cautious, to move like a ghost, but the thought of him bleeding out in the snow was a fire at her heels. The citadel behind her had erupted into a chaotic swarm of activity, claxons blaring a mournful dirge that the storm fought to suppress. The Wimpel guards were now hunting with a fanatic's fury. She found him barely conscious, his body dangerously cold, the pistol still clutched in his hand. Knew you'd be back, he slurred, a faint, pained smile on his lips. The exfiltration was the single hardest thing she had ever done. It was a blur of grit and desperation. She half carried, half dragged him down the treacherous mountain face, his dead weight a constant, grueling burden. The storm that had been their shield now became their enemy, its fury unabated. Twice they had to flatten themselves into the snow as searchlights cut through the blizzard, the shouts of the hunting parties terrifyingly close. But they made it. They reached the emergency extraction point at the base of the mountain just as the first light of dawn was beginning to pierce the storm clouds, a pale, hopeful gray. Days later, the world came back into focus in the quiet, sterile white of a field hospital. Marta sat by Elias's bed. He was alive. He would keep the leg. The doctors called it a miracle. Marta knew it was a testament to his own stubborn refusal to die. "They're calling it the decapitation," he told her one afternoon, his voice still weak as he gestured to a tablet. The news was everywhere. The Kyrgyz Federation's command structure, deprived of its 5 most essential leaders in a matter of weeks, had imploded. Factional infighting, mass desertions, and a collapse in morale had led to a ceasefire. The war was, for all intents and purposes, over. Their impossible mission had worked. When she finally returned to the main base, the atmosphere was different. The whispers that had followed her were gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, silent respect that was almost more uncomfortable. The soldiers she passed parted ways for her, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. She was a living myth, a ghost who had walked out of the storm, and she felt more isolated than ever. She saw Thorn in a corridor. He was walking towards her, and for a moment she tensed, expecting a final confrontation. But he stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a problem or an anomaly, but as a soldier. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He gave her a single, sharp, unequivocal nod, a gesture of pure, hard-won professional respect. It was his surrender, his acknowledgement. Then he walked past. The war between them was over too. That evening, Marta stood in her own quarters, the first moment she'd had to herself in what felt like a lifetime. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. She saw the new lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the fading bruise on her cheek. She looked tired. She looked older. She slowly pulled the dented locket from under her shirt. She didn't open it. She didn't need to conjure the ghosts anymore. The burning rage, the gnawing need for vengeance, it was all gone. In its place was not peace, not yet, but a quiet, profound stillness. A settled grief. She had not erased the past, but she had survived it. She had faced the monster in the fortress, but more importantly, she had faced the one inside herself, and she had chosen not to become it. The face in the mirror was not the ghost of a 16-year-old girl lost to fire and smoke. It was not the dispassionate phantom of the mountains known as Valkyrie. It was Sergeant Marta Rostova, a soldier, a survivor. A woman who had walked through hell and had chosen, at the very end, to walk back into the light. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The air in the Valmiran mountains, once thin and sharp with the promise of violence, was now thick with the scent of freshly cut pine and damp earth. The sound that echoed through the valley was not the crack of a rifle, but the rhythmic, steady tap of a hammer against wood. Marta Rostova worked with a quiet focus, her hands, which had once held the cold steel of a rifle with absolute stillness, now guiding a saw through a fresh plank of oak. She was rebuilding her family's home on the very foundation where the old one had been turned to ash. The work was slow, hard, and honest. Each nail she drove was an act of creation, a small defiance against the destruction that had defined her life for so long. A crunch of gravel on the path announced his arrival. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that had once been a stranger to her face. Elias Vance walked towards her, leaning lightly on a simple wooden cane. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid in the snow. He carried a small bag of groceries. "Thought you might be low on coffee," he said, his voice the same calm anchor it had always been. "You thought right," she replied, wiping sawdust from her hands. They sat on the half-finished porch, drinking coffee from chipped mugs as they looked out at the valley. They didn't speak of the war, of the generals, or of the fortress in the sky. They didn't have to. The silence between them was filled with the weight of all they had shared, a bond forged in fire and ice that needed no words. Later that afternoon, after Elias had left, Marta walked to a small, quiet grove of birch trees just beyond the house. There, under the oldest tree, was a simple, flat stone she had placed to mark the memory of her family. She pulled the dented locket from under her shirt. For a long moment, she held it in, her palm, the metal warm from her skin. Then, with a gentle click, she opened it. She carefully removed the two faded, fragile wildflowers, the mountain lavender and the edelweiss, and placed them at the base of the stone. She wasn't burying the past. She was setting it free. The ghosts of vengeance had been laid to rest, not by the bullet that had killed Volkov, but by the choice she had made in that final, silent moment. The locket, once a vessel for her rage, was now just a memento of a girl who had loved, and a boy who had woven flowers into her hair. She closed it and tucked it away, its weight somehow lighter than before. She stood, turning her face to the setting sun. The mountains that had once been her hunting ground, her cover, and her vantage point were simply mountains again. They were home. The echoes of the war would always be a part of her, but they were now just that. Echoes. The roar had faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the pines. The ghost was gone. The soldier had survived, and the woman, at last, was at peace.